Chapter 3, the food supply, screencast 3. So of the 4 screencasts for Chapter 3, this is actually the longest one. And the reason why it's the longest one, it's focusing on the various causes out there of food poisoning and other types of things related to that. Now, one of the things that you'll notice, there are a lot of tables about various pathogens and things like that. Now, if you go to our Blackboard materials for this chapter, you will notice a different PowerPoint. It's a pathogen PowerPoint. And I want to point out that those are the pathogens you are actually responsible for. So you are not responsible for all the pathogens. It's a really overwhelming number. And I will point out along the way the ones that I think are especially important. But with regards to the exam, you definitely want to take a look at that PowerPoint presentation because it really is the ones that you are responsible for. Now, one of the things I think we have to take for granted in the United States is overall, we have pretty decent food and water safety and quality. I think that's important for us to realize. Now, I do have some concerns because one of the things that's currently happening in our political climate is there have been significant decreases or layoffs in the FDA. And what that means, there's just not as many food inspectors that are going out there checking out meat issues and things like that. So I think, and unfortunately, that is a concern that we are currently living in because of the political climate. So I think it's important that that's something that you are aware of. Now, we do have a very abundant and varied access to food and water. And as I said before, we overall in the United States have a really good, safe supply. But there are some situations in which there may be a danger or a risk to our food and water supply. And really good examples are, we are smack in the middle of hurricane season. Now, considering where we live in Western New York, it's not necessarily an issue. I grew up in New England, and there were a number of times when we experienced some severe hurricanes. And kind of think about what happens when you hear there's going to be an inch of snow in Western New York. Everyone goes to Wegmans, and you can't find water or any staples. So there are situations, especially related to natural disasters, in which it may impact our access to clean water especially. So I do want you to kind of keep that in mind. But in addition to natural disasters, there are other situations that actually put our food supply at risk. Now, what we're going to be focusing on in this section are various pathogens and chemicals that may potentially face or result in some health risk. Now, first off, we kind of want to talk about an overview of foodborne illnesses. Chances are many of you have experienced some slight case of food poisoning. So I think we've been there. We've done that. One thing typically, the symptoms associated with food poisoning do not present themselves right away. There usually is an incubation period. So that's also something to kind of keep in mind. But when we look at the number of Americans, okay, approximately 47.8 million illnesses are reported that are due to foodborne pathogens. Now, something important, this is probably underreported because most cases go undiagnosed. So let's see why that might be the reason why this number is not truly reflective of the number of Americans that are actually experiencing some type of foodborne illness. If I look at the symptoms, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, intestinal cramping, they are really, really not specific and associated with other clinical symptoms and other clinical disorders. So that's one reason we see a significant underreport of foodborne illnesses. And once again, these are very, very general GI effects. Now, people experiencing very severe foodborne illnesses are probably the ones that are actually being diagnosed and are actually getting reported. And the symptoms are much more severe than the ones that are listed here, especially with these particular symptoms being much more severe as opposed to a mild case of food poisoning. Now, as I said, about 25% of the population is at increased risk of foodborne illness. Now, when contamination occurs, many people can be affected because most of the food we eat is grown on large farms and is transported to processing plants or supermarkets. Just recently, there have been a number of relatively large-scale food recalls due to listeria. A lot of the food recalls that we have seen recently have been bagged salad packages and things like that. You kind of remember, if it was last year or before that, there was actually a big issue with romaine lettuce being contaminated. So those are things that we can see overall. Now, another source of food poisoning is how is that food handled, either in the service industry, such as a restaurant or something along those lines, or our actual home kitchens. Now, one of the things that I normally do if we were meeting face to face, we would play a little game called Do I Want to Eat at Your House? And I will post this project or activity. I think it is really worthwhile to take a look at what your overall habits are with regards to food safety and see where you fall along this scale. I think it's a really good activity. It's one of the things that I miss about not meeting face to face, but I will make that available and you can actually kind of take it on your own. And I think it's important because, once again, how we handle food ourselves determines our risk and our family's risk for having foodborne illnesses. Now, generally, the pathogens that we are mostly concerned with that contribute to food poisoning are microbial. So we're really looking at viruses and bacteria, and really bacteria more so than viruses. And we'll see the list of the pathogens in just a little bit. Now, other types of pathogens may be fungi and parasites. So once again, but viruses and bacteria really are the ones that are most responsible for the more common foodborne illnesses out there. Now, basically what happens, there's two pathways in which a foodborne illness created by a pathogen can actually take place. So the microorganism can either infect the cells of the GI tract, and so that's a foodborne infection. Now, others may actually secrete a toxin into the food we eat, and so now we're actually looking at an intoxication and not an infection. So there's two very different, but those are the general pathways in which a microbial pathogen may cause symptoms related to the food that we eat. Now, bacteria are probably the biggest. Okay. Now, one of the things that I think we are more aware of because of COVID is the importance of really washing our hands regularly. I haven't seen if our increase in hand washing has had any impact on the amount of foodborne illnesses out there, but also it's really hard to kind of take a look at that because many restaurants are closed or have limited operating capacities. So it's really hard, but one thing that we do know, proper hand washing is probably one of the most important things we can do to minimize the spread of any pathogen, so be that bacterial or viral. So once again, I think that's really important. Now, generally, what ends up happening as far as how bacteria and viruses actually contaminate our food, there's these general mechanisms. So generally, there's contamination by feces, contamination by an infected individual, or cross-contamination. So those are the general routes in which these diseases actually make their way into or impact humans. Now, when we look at bacteria, so bacteria are very simple single-celled organisms, and they're everywhere. Okay, we need to keep that in mind. Okay, and the other thing that I think is important, not all bacteria are bad. There's lots of bacteria that are very good for us. Some of you may take some probiotics for GI symptoms and things like that. So let's not get into the situation where you hear the term bacteria and think that all bacteria are bad. In the grand scheme of things, very few bacteria are actually pathogenic. So like I said, most of them are very harmless. Now, if we look at common sources of pathogenic bacteria, this isn't really surprising here. So if we look at meat, poultry, eggs, fish, shellfish, unpasteurized dairy products, and fresh produce. Fortunately, that pretty much covers almost everything we eat, okay? So we have to kind of keep that in mind, okay? So these pathogens are pretty much everywhere, okay? So that's why the proper handling of food, cooking, storage, and all of those things is really critical, because those processes are designed to help prevent us from bacterial infection or contamination. Now, bacteria, as we know, are living, and so they need three things, okay? They need nutrients, water, and warmth to proliferate. Now, it's not often that I ask people to memorize things, but this is one of those situations. And I want you to know the range in which we consider to be the danger zone. So when we're talking about bacteria in particular, the danger zone is 41 degrees to 135 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay, so that is the range of temperatures in which most bacteria will do best and multiply and all of those things. Okay, they also do well in oxygen-rich environments and also environments that are not acidic. So that's important. Okay, so that's really important that we kind of keep that in mind overall. Now, when we talk about high temperatures will kill the pathogen. Okay, but if this happens to be a toxin-producing pathogen, the high heat will not inactivate the toxins produced. That's really important. Okay, now I do want to kind of take a look at this. So we have the danger zone. So once again, 41 to 135 degrees Fahrenheit. That's the temperature range in which bacteria grow quickly. Do not store things within this temperature range for more than 1 to 2 hours. Now, the issue here is if you're looking at a party, if you're looking at a barbecue or a family gathering, many of them go beyond 2 hours. And this is Western New York. We like our mac salad, okay? Things that have mayonnaise. And think about the temperature range where you're at a cookout or a barbecue, and that salad may be out for a long period of time. Not a good situation. Now, when we talk about colder temperatures, okay? Now, I have a tendency, I like things really, really cold. It's hard to be a really, really cold glass of milk. And so I pretty much have my refrigerator and freezer cranked up all the way. It's not uncommon for the water in my pitcher to freeze, or if I have carrots for my dog on the top shelf of the refrigerator, they get frozen. I like things cold, all right? Now, cold temperatures do not kill bacteria, okay? What you're actually doing is decreasing the rate at which they reproduce. So some bacteria can still reproduce at these normal ranges we might find due to refrigeration or icing something down. Now, freezing also, okay? Bacteria cannot grow in a freezing environment, but if you thaw out what was frozen and that bacteria are there, they will be there upon thawing the material, okay? So how we thaw things out, okay, is also really important. Now, if we look at some other ranges here, so the temperature range for holding thoroughly cooked food prevents growth of bacteria, but doesn't necessarily destroy them. So that's about that. Overall 57 to 74 to 165, and kind of notice the temperatures that are really necessary to kill bacteria. Okay, so they're relatively high, typically 100 to 212 degrees is going to be the temperature range, and kind of notice how that ties into internal meat temperature. I'm hoping many of you use a meat thermometer when you're cooking various types of meat, especially if you're one of those individuals that like your meat medium rare, and so on. It's really important that you do use a meat thermometer to make sure that it's cooked to the appropriate temperature. Some bacteria actually require a pressure canner. Botulism would be a really example of those. So keep in mind, okay, how important temperature is with regards to bacteria and that danger zone. You definitely do not want to leave things out in that range of 41 to 135 degrees, because that's really where we start to see bacteria thrive, okay? Now here, once again, this is basically from the previous table, and it just goes into a little bit more detail about the impact of temperature on microbes, bacteria in particular, that cause foodborne illness. We kind of discussed this previously, but this is just a larger view of that particular diagram that we talked about already. The following are examples of a number of different types of bacteria that we know of, and I'm going to not go through all of this, okay? I really do suggest that you review the appropriate PowerPoint that talks about the pathogens that you are in particular responsible for. And what I did, I just pulled a couple from these tables that are in the textbook and giving you the ones that I will potentially refer to on our first exam. But we know some of these, okay? If we know about Salmonella, if we know about E. coli, Shigella, those are all very, very common types of bacteria. And I'm not going to read through these. You can actually take a look at them on your own. But I do want you to kind of take note at the onset of symptoms. So keep in mind, most foodborne illnesses actually take time to incubate. Remember, the bacteria actually have to multiply. And so it does take some time. So very rarely, if you are sick maybe 1 hour after eating something, chances are it might be something else. It might be a stomach bug, something along those lines, and not necessarily food poisoning, because as you note here, very few, okay, present themselves very quickly. The exception to the rule would be the staph that we see here. That is commonly found in ham, poultry, egg salads, cream-filled pastries, custards, whipped cream. And the onset can actually be anywhere from 1 to 6 hours. So, so that is something to keep in mind, okay? And as I said, there's quite a few of them, okay? So you want to put the focus on those that I have included. Another real common one that you've probably heard about is Listeria. So that's another one. So you are responsible for the ones that I have actually put on that separate presentation. Now, viruses are also, and viruses basically require a host. And so how viruses work, they basically reproduce after they've invaded the host. They take over and use the cell's reproductive machinery to actually produce more virus. Now, the key to preventing illnesses by viruses is sanitary food prep practices. And as I said, the most important one that we have is going to be hand washing. Okay. Now, if we look at a couple of viruses in particular, these are the two that I really want you to be comfortable with. We have noroviruses and Hep A. Okay. Generally, we're looking at how foods get infected. The primary source of infection here is infected food handlers. So washing hands is really, really important when we're talking about preventing these. So once again, you should be familiar with some sources, okay, so typical food sources, or how these pathogens or viral infections are actually passed on, and so on. So I think that's something to kind of keep in mind when we're looking at those for the most part. Now, if we look at parasites, so parasites are basically living organisms that live in or on another organism. So if we look at tapeworms, protozoans, things like that, a lot of issues we see with contaminated water. Okay, those of you that have gone to Mexico, we know about not drinking the water in Mexico. And those infections are usually due to parasites in nature or protozoan. If you spend a lot of time camping in the Adirondacks or something like that, it is especially important that you filter your water. Okay, that lake might look really, really inviting, but chances are there's lots of different organisms that can potentially result in foodborne illness that are there. Okay, So generally when we talk about parasites, they're spread person to person or due to some type of contamination, food, water, or soil. Okay, so not a lot of parasites we typically worry about, but depending upon where you are, if we're looking at times where the water supply is contaminated, such as a hurricane or something like that, those are situations where we start to see problems with parasites. Okay, so here once again are some examples. You probably are most familiar with the trichinosis. That's actually about not with pork or wild game. That's probably the one that you're most familiar with overall. Now, prions, these are infectious protein particles, and you may be familiar with mad cow disease. Okay, and if we look at these infections, they're created by prions, and what they are protein fragments, and basically the diseases that are a result of prions are fatal. Okay, there have been some situations. I know I had a student a couple years ago that was working at one of the local hospitals, and one of the patients she was taking care of was actually there for mad cow disease and actually died from that. Okay. Now, one of the things to keep in mind when we're talking about prions survive high heat. Okay, so there's not a lot that you can do to kill them. Now, one of the concerns, now this is fall and we are actually approaching the hunting season, and you may have heard about zombie deer. And zombie deer are these deer that appear to be affected with a prion type disorder. And hunters or people hiking in the forest, if you actually encounter a deer that's presenting these type of symptoms, okay, they're zombie-like, they're kind of not walking right, they're going to be very skinny, okay, and so on. It is recommended that you report to a park service or county service, something along those lines, so that they're aware of the presence of these. They have been identified and seen in Western New York. So those of you that hunt or spend a lot of time hiking in areas where deer are prevalent, this is something to be on the lookout for, because it is a prion type infection that we see in these animals. Now, there's also going to be toxins, so molds, algae, plants. And when we talk about these toxins, molds really like moist, dark environments. Now, one of the things that we'll see are endospores, and they will appear on the outside of food, and they're going to be fuzzy, colorful in appearance. A really good example would be strawberries. Okay, so strawberries when they've gone bad. Foods that are very likely to have mold. You may have seen cheeses, bread in particular. If you buy fresh bread from Wegmans, if you don't eat that in a short period of time, you will notice, because once again, it's a fresh bread, mold will appear relatively quickly, generally within 3 to 4 days after purchasing that bread item. And also fresh produce. I use strawberries as an example overall. Now, if we look at some other toxins, okay, so molds will change the color, texture, taste of things, okay? Now, the real concern here is some of these molds actually produce what are known as mycotoxins, and these can cause some pretty significant diseases, so blood disease, damage to liver and kidneys, and also disorders of the nervous system. So that's one concern. Now, if we look at others, such as aflatoxin, okay, this is something that actually will cause liver cancer. Now, one of the concerns that I had, as I said before, I grew up in a beach resort town, Newport, Rhode Island, and so I'm all about seafood, okay? And seafood is one of those foods that is actually at greater risk for toxins, and this is actually due to algae contamination. So a really good example is red tide. I think there were a couple of years ago, you may have heard of the red tide proliferation that Florida was facing, and the number of marine animals and fish that were actually killed by the red tide, and the impact it had on restaurants, especially those that serve seafood. Generally, okay, the fish and shellfish look fine. Okay? The problem is the toxin. And the thing that we need to remember here, these toxins are not destroyed by cooking or freezing. And what we see here is basically raw bars are very common. I'm not a big fan. I know some people love their raw oysters and things like that. But to me, it's like snot. Okay, so not something I'm a fan of. You may like them, but I would not be one of those individuals. But shellfish, that's a really good example of things that may actually have toxins in them. Now, plants also can produce a variety of natural toxins. And generally, these animals, the production of these toxins are basically protective in nature to compete with other plant species and also to protect themselves from ingestion from other animals. Now, we'll see an increase in production of these toxins when the plant is in a stressed environment. A really good example is the solanine production in potatoes. Okay, so this increases when potatoes start to sprout and are stored in brightly lit places. So if you see those potatoes in particular, lots of sprouting, there's a good chance that that potato is no longer good. So that's something to kind of keep in mind. Now, if we look at some of these, there's a couple in particular that I want you to kind of keep in mind here. The biggest is going to be aflatoxin. Okay, and the type of places where you might see aflatoxin would be corn, peanuts, rice, wheat, spices, nuts, especially when these foods are stressed due to drought or disease. And acute toxicity is going to be liver damage, or there's going to be an issue with malnutrition, other types of things. So this is one of the ones that's actually dangerous. Bad peanuts is a really good example. Okay, that's probably one of the more common sources that we'll see. And overall, you may have heard of pufferfish toxin, okay, tetrodotoxin. And what that is, it's a very fast acting, okay, and you may have heard of fugu. And this is actually a traditional delicacy in Japan. And the chef must actually be licensed to produce this type of sushi. So once again, pufferfish in particular. And what happens basically, this toxin acts as a paralytic for the most part. And people eventually die from respiratory failure primarily. And once again, you want to look at the separate PowerPoint presentation focusing on all of the pathogens that you are actually responsible for.